Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
I used to work as a deckhand and lifeguard on a snorkel excursion boat a few years back during the pandemic. I'm pretty experienced with free diving and occasionally do some spearfishing. One day, my friend who works as a photographer added me to this diving group she was part of. I was pretty excited since I didn't have many diving buddies at the time and diving alone isn't the safest option. My living situation was a bit complicated. I was staying with my partner and their parents, and my partner's mother had serious health conditions that made her high risk for complications. Because of this, we were really strict about following safety protocols and social distancing. I decided to join one of their dive days anyway, thinking it would be easy enough to keep my distance outdoors with a small group. There were about 7 other people there. Right from the start, I could tell something was off. While trying to socialize before getting in the water, everyone formed this tight circle, standing shoulder to shoulder. I tried joining in but had to keep my distance, which left me awkwardly hovering on the outside. I tried to start the conversation by asking about the new dive spot that had opened up north. Someone briefly mentioned they'd been there the previous week and that the visibility was amazing, but that was it. They just went back to their conversation, completely ignoring me. After a few more attempts at joining in, I gave up. After that experience, I decided to only join smaller dives until things got safer. I still checked the group chat regularly though and learned quite a bit about these people. Many were vegans. They weren't thrilled when I asked if anyone wanted to go spearfishing. About half were against vaccines, and most were either photographers or social media influencers. At work, we needed someone to cover the other days I wasn't working, so I mentioned the job opening in the group chat since I knew they could all free dive the required 40 feet. Only one person showed interest, but their schedule didn't work out. Then one day I couldn't find the group chat anymore. Turns out the admin, who I'll call Karen, had removed me without saying anything. When I asked her about it, she told me they needed to make room for people who would actually participate in dives, pointing out that I hadn't been joining them lately. I reminded her that I had explained I was only comfortable with smaller groups because of my living situation. She simply responded that they needed active members. What Karen didn't know was that I also ran our boat company's social media accounts. A few days after kicking me out, she sent our company a message. In it, she introduced herself as a social media influencer with a significant following. She proposed promoting our snorkel excursions to her audience, promising a boost in bookings from her followers in exchange for a free half-day trip to the neighboring island. I wrote back explaining that due to current restrictions, our capacity was already limited to half, and we were actually overbooked most days. I mentioned we were also short-staffed and only operate in 3 days a week. I made it clear that without a contract showing guaranteed booking numbers and compensation, if those numbers weren't met, we couldn't justify giving away free trips over paying customers. I offered her our resident discount rate and pointedly mentioned that we were still hiring if she was looking for work in these difficult times. She never responded. But the story gets better. About 6 months later, when travel picked up again, our business exploded. We were running 3 to 4 trips daily, almost back to back, and I was making more money than ever before. I ended up saving enough for a major purchase years ahead of schedule. Sometimes I think about how if Karen had taken the job instead of trying to get free stuff, she could have had steady work on the water and made great money, but I guess that wouldn't have given her enough exposure for her social media. A few weeks ago, I saw her promoting another snorkel company on social media, one that's known for being twice as expensive as ours and having half the experience. I guess some people never learn. I'm a convenience store clerk and I've been working at this small family-owned store for about 3 years now. The store is in a decent neighborhood and most customers are friendly enough. That was until last Tuesday when I had the most insane encounter of my life. It was around 8 p.m. and I was halfway through my shift when this woman in an expensive-looking suit walked in. Right away, I could tell something was off about her. She was talking loudly on her phone about some meeting that apparently didn't go her way, and she was making a big show of how everyone else was incompetent. She grabbed a coffee from our self-serve station and came to the counter. I rang her up, and that's when things went sideways. I told her the total was $2.50. She immediately got upset, asking if I was serious about charging that much for a coffee. I explained that it was our standard price for a large coffee. She then tried to claim she only filled it halfway, so she should only have to pay half the price. I looked at her cup, which was clearly filled to the brim. When I pointed this out politely, she accused me of calling her a liar and demanded to speak to my manager. I explained that I was the only one there at the moment, but offered to give her our store owner's business card. That's when she really lost it. She started ranting about being an executive vice president at her company and asked if I knew how much money she made in an hour, claiming she didn't have time for this. She then did something I never expected. She threw the hot coffee at me. Thankfully, her aim was terrible, and most of it hit the counter, but some splashed on my arm. I immediately called the police while she started screaming about how I assaulted her by making her spill her coffee. The police arrived pretty quickly. 2 officers tried to talk to her, but she kept interrupting them and me whenever we tried to explain what happened. They eventually had enough and put her in the back of one of their police cars while they reviewed our security footage and took statements. That's when things got really crazy. Somehow, she managed to get into the front seat of the police car. Next thing I knew, she was speeding off with the police lights still flashing. The officers jumped into their other car and radioed for backup. I watched on the store's outdoor camera as more police cars joined the chase. She was driving like a maniac, weaving through traffic. The police tried everything, spike strips, pursuit intervention techniques, but she kept dodging them somehow. It was like watching a movie. This went on for about an hour. The chase made its way onto the highway, where a truck driver apparently had been listening to the whole thing unfold on his radio. As Karen tried to pass him on the right shoulder, he made a split-second decision. The trucker turned his rig slightly, boxing her in between his truck and the concrete barrier. The police car finally came to a stop, though it did quite a number on both vehicles. The truck driver later told the police he couldn't just stand by and watch her potentially hurt someone. They arrested her, and this time they made sure she was properly secured. Turns out she had a history of similar entitled behavior, but this was by far her worst offense. They charged her with assault, theft of a police vehicle, evading arrest, and about a dozen traffic violations. The truck driver became an instant local hero, but his insurance wouldn't cover the damage since he intentionally used his truck to stop her. When the story hit the local news, someone started a fundraiser for him. Last I heard, they raised over $50,000, enough to not only fix his truck but also give it a complete upgrade. Karen lost her executive job, and from what I heard, she's facing serious prison time. During her court appearance, she tried to argue that she was having a medical episode brought on by work stress, but the judge wasn't buying it. The security footage from our store and her previous record painted a pretty clear picture. The police department gave the truck driver a civilian commendation, and they even invited him to speak at their annual Community Service Awards. They also implemented new protocols for securing detained individuals in police vehicles. Apparently, she had managed to slip through a partition that wasn't properly locked. The store owner was so impressed with how I handled the situation that he gave me a raise and made me the shift supervisor. We also got a new coffee station with sealed dispensers, just in case anyone else gets any bright ideas about throwing hot beverages. I've had to tell this story countless times, but honestly, I still can't believe it actually happened. Every time I see a police car now, I double-check to make sure nobody's going to steal it. Life changes in ways you never expect. 5 years ago, my daughter was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis at just 11 years old. As a single parent, watching your child struggle with a degenerative condition is heart-wrenching. The disease gradually took away her perfect balance and the vision in her left eye, but it never touched her spirit. These days she can walk using her walker, but only for short distances. about 250 feet at most. It might sound like a decent distance until you realize that's barely enough to get through 2 aisles at a big store. That's why we rely on those electric shopping carts. They're not just a convenience, they're her independence. Last weekend, we were at the local superstore doing our regular shopping. My daughter was riding in the electric cart while I walked beside her, helping her reach items from higher shelves. Everything was going fine until this elderly man, probably in his 70s, approached us in the household goods section. He stood there tapping his foot impatiently while staring at my daughter. I could feel something brewing, but I hoped he'd just move along. He didn't. Instead, he demanded that my daughter get up from the cart immediately. I tried to keep my cool and smiled politely, but I could feel my maternal instincts starting to flare up. I explained to him that my daughter needed the cart to shop, but he wouldn't hear it. He scoffed and insisted that she was just a teenager, declaring that these carts were meant for people who actually needed them. His voice kept getting louder, attracting attention from other shoppers. He started ranting about how young and lazy she was, suggesting that some elderly person could make better use of the cart instead of what he called a kid joyriding around the store. I took a deep breath, counting to 10 in my head. My daughter looked at me with that mischievous glint in her eye, the one that told me she had a plan. I decided to play along and suggested that she show this kind gentleman exactly why she was using the cart. My daughter agreed with a grin. She gripped her walker, which we always bring with us, and slowly stood up. Her legs trembled as she took those wobbly steps toward him. Each step was a battle for balance, her body swaying like she'd had way too much to drink. The man's face began to change as realization dawned. My daughter stopped right in front of him, her leg shaking with the effort of standing still. She explained to him that this was what multiple sclerosis looked like. She told him about being 16 and young, but emphasized that this was why she needed the cart. She challenged him to imagine trying to shop for an hour in her condition. The man's face turned bright red. Other shoppers who had gathered around started whispering and shaking their heads at him. One shopper sarcastically congratulated him on judging a disabled teenager, while another suggested that some people should mind their own business. My daughter wasn't done though. When I helped her back into the cart, she delivered her final message. She explained how this was exactly why people shouldn't judge a book by its cover. She educated him about how not all disabilities are visible and not all disabled people are old. She finished by expressing hope that he'd remember this lesson before harassing anyone else using a mobility aid. The elderly man stood there, mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Without another word, he turned around and practically ran away from our aisle, leaving his empty shopping cart behind. A few shoppers actually applauded, and one older lady approached to commend my daughter for standing up for herself. We finished our shopping in peace, and I couldn't have been prouder of how my daughter handled the situation. With grace, dignity, and just the right amount of sass to teach someone a tough lesson. I've been working as a delivery driver for FedEx in Boston for about 8 years now. Started right after I got out of the Marines, where I served 2 tours in Afghanistan. The military taught me discipline, but it also taught me that sometimes you need to get creative when dealing with entitled people who think they're better than everyone else. Boston's my hometown, and I know every street, every alley, and every shortcut in this city. Trust me, when you're making deliveries in a city with streets that look like they were designed by a drunk medieval architect, you need to know your way around. Most days, I enjoy my job. The regular customers are nice, and I get to be outdoors instead of being stuck in an office. So there I was, making my usual delivery rounds in downtown Boston. It was a sunny Thursday afternoon, and I had a package for this fancy hotel. You know, one of those places where they charge you $500 a night just so you can brag about staying there. The hotel sits right at this crazy 5-way intersection that tourists absolutely hate, but us locals have mastered like an art form. I had just grabbed the package from my truck and was walking toward the hotel entrance when this shiny red Porsche convertible comes screeching up to the curb. The driver, this guy in what must have been a $5,000 suit, didn't even bother to look at me properly. He just assumed I was the valet because I was standing there in my uniform. Without even looking at me properly, he tossed his keys in my direction and told me to keep the car close, saying he'd only be gone for 10 or 15 minutes. He didn't even wait for a response, just threw the keys and strutted away like he owned the place. Now, normally, I would have just called out to him and explained that I wasn't the valet, but something about his attitude just rubbed me the wrong way. Maybe it was the way he didn't even look me in the eye, or how he just assumed anyone in a uniform was there to serve him. I caught those keys mid-air, thank you, Marine Corps reflexes, and looked at them for a moment. The package I was delivering could wait 5 minutes. After all, the customer service training always says to go above and beyond, right? I got into that Porsche and let me tell you, it still had that new car smell. The leather seats probably cost more than my monthly rent, but I wasn't there to admire the interior. I had a plan forming in my head, something that would teach our friend a lesson about making assumptions. You see, being a delivery driver in Boston means you know all sorts of interesting spots in the city, like that 5-way intersection right in front of the hotel. It's absolute chaos during rush hour, which was just about to start. Perfect timing. I started up the engine, it purred like a kitten, and took off. Now, I'm not usually one for making a scene, but sometimes you need to embrace the moment. There I was, this bold Irish guy from South Boston, driving this fancy Porsche convertible with the top down circling that 5-way intersection like it was my own personal racetrack. And because I'm a history buff with a flair for the dramatic, I started shouting at the top of my lungs, repeatedly yelling that the British were coming, just like Paul Revere would have done. People on the sidewalks were taking videos. Some were laughing, others looked confused, but I was having the time of my life. I did 3 full laps around that intersection, each time getting more theatrical with my Paul Revere impression. Finally, for my grand finale, I pulled right into the middle of that 5-way intersection, right where everyone could see. I left the engine running, door wide open, and walked away with the biggest grin on my face. I headed back to my delivery truck, dropped off the package at the hotel's front desk, and went about my day. From my truck, I had a perfect view of what happened next. That rich guy came storming out of the hotel about 5 minutes later, probably expecting his car to be waiting right where he left it. His face turned as red as his Porsche when he couldn't find it. Then someone pointed to the middle of the intersection, where his precious car was causing quite the traffic jam. The rich guy started screaming, demanding to know who had done this. He yelled that he wanted to know where the valet was, and threatened to have someone fired for this. The hotel manager calmly explained that their valet parking was actually around the corner, and that the person he'd given his keys to wasn't their valet. The rich guy, still not getting it, demanded to know what the manager meant about him not being a valet. The hotel manager had to spell it out for him, explaining that they have very specific uniforms for their valets, and they definitely don't wear FedEx uniforms. He had to walk out into the middle of that intersection, with horns blaring all around him, to retrieve his car. Every single person at every single corner of that 5-way intersection had their phones out, recording the whole thing. As I drove away, I could still hear him yelling about calling the police and his lawyer. But what was he going to say? I gave my keys to a random person who never claimed to be a valet? Good luck with that case. Word got around pretty quick among the other delivery drivers in the area. Every time I make a delivery to that hotel now, the actual valets give me a knowing nod. Some even call me Paul Revere when their managers aren't around. A week later, I saw that same red Porsche at a different hotel. This time, the owner actually checked if the person was a valet before handing over his keys. I guess some lessons do stick. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.